What happens when NASA funds a project to communicate with another intelligent species, and the experiment ends with a flooded house, LSD, a woman living alone with a dolphin, and a death that was later described as suicide? In the 1960s, a group of scientists became convinced that dolphins might be intelligent enough to communicate with humans. But they weren't only interested in dolphins, they were thinking about something much bigger. If humans ever encountered intelligent life somewhere beyond Earth, how would we communicate with it? And if we couldn't understand another intelligent species here on Earth, how could we ever hope to understand an alien one? This is the strange and disturbing story of John Lilly, Margaret Howe Lovatt, and a dolphin named Peter. In the early 1960s, John C. Lilly was already a controversial but respected neuroscientist. He had spent years studying the brain and investigating the intelligence and communication abilities of dolphins. Lilly believed that dolphins were far more intelligent than most people realized. And he had a radical idea. Maybe the problem wasn't that dolphins couldn't communicate. Maybe the problem was that humans didn't know how to listen. Lilly became interested in the possibility of communication between different intelligent species, and this idea eventually crossed paths with one of the biggest scientific questions of the space age. Could humans communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence? In 1961, Lilly attended a meeting at the Green Bank Observatory, where scientists discussed the search for intelligent life beyond Earth. The group became associated with what was called the Order of the Dolphin. The connection between dolphins and extraterrestrial intelligence might sound ridiculous today, but at the time the logic was surprisingly simple. If dolphins were intelligent beings living in an environment completely different from ours, then learning to communicate with them could teach humanity something about communicating with any intelligent species. And NASA was interested enough to fund Lilly's work. NASA records describe Lilly's grant as a study of the feasibility and methodology of establishing communication between humans and other species. The dolphin became a kind of rehearsal for the possibility of meeting something intelligent that was not human. In 1963, Lilly established a research facility on the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It became known as the Communication Research Institute, and eventually, the Dolphin House. 3 dolphins were brought into the project: Sissy, Pamela, and a young male bottlenose dolphin named Peter. The researchers wanted to know whether dolphins could learn aspects of human language. They weren't simply teaching tricks. They were attempting something much more ambitious. They wanted the dolphins to reproduce human-like sounds, to associate words with objects and actions, and eventually, to communicate. Then a young woman named Margaret Howe arrived. She was in her early 20s. She wasn't a famous scientist. She was a volunteer with a fascination for animal behavior and communication. But Lilly and the other researchers quickly recognized her ability to work with the dolphins. Margaret became particularly interested in Peter, and she began teaching him. At first, the lessons were simple: words, numbers, names, greetings. Hello? Peter. Margaret. Again, and again, and again. Margaret would carefully pronounce sounds and encourage Peter to imitate them. The problem was that a dolphin doesn't have a human mouth. It doesn't have vocal cords like ours, and it produces sounds in a completely different way. Peter could produce extraordinary noises, but turning those sounds into recognizable human speech was another matter entirely. Still, Margaret believed that something important could happen if she spent enough time with him. And this is where the experiment became truly strange. Margaret noticed that everyone left the laboratory at the end of the day. The humans went home, the dolphins stayed behind, and she began wondering, what if the dolphin never had to leave the language environment? What if you treated the dolphin the way you would treat a human child? Surround it with language, all day, every day. So they changed the laboratory. Part of the house was flooded. Water filled the lower level. Peter could swim through the living space while Margaret remained there with him. For weeks, she essentially lived with the dolphin. She slept there. She ate there. She taught him there. She spent hours observing him. The experiment was no longer simply a series of lessons. It had become a relationship. Margaret and Peter were together for enormous amounts of time, and the closer they became, the more complicated the experiment became. Peter was an adolescent male dolphin, and he began displaying sexual behavior toward Margaret. It became a problem because it repeatedly interrupted the language lessons. Margaret later explained that she chose to relieve his sexual urges rather than constantly separate him from the lessons. She did not describe the act as romantic or sexual on her part. To her, it was something that had become another part of living with Peter. And once again, the scientific boundary between researcher and subject became blurred. The experiment was supposed to teach a dolphin English. Instead, Margaret was becoming part teacher, part caretaker, part companion, and almost a member of Peter's social world. But while Margaret was trying to teach Peter language, Lilly was becoming increasingly interested in another possibility. Drugs. LSD had become a subject of scientific research in the 1960s. Lilly was fascinated by altered states of consciousness. He wondered whether changing the dolphin's mental state could somehow change the way it communicated. So LSD entered the Dolphin House story. Lilly experimented with the drug on dolphins. Margaret opposed giving LSD to Peter and said she would not allow it to happen to him. The experiments did not produce the breakthrough Lilly wanted. There was no sudden dolphin language, no hidden dictionary, no conversation, no evidence that LSD unlocked an alien communication system. Instead, the project became increasingly controversial, and Lilly himself became more interested in psychedelic research. The original dream, communication, was beginning to disappear behind experimentation. By 1965 and 1966, the project was losing momentum. The researchers had not achieved their original goal. Peter had not learned to speak English, and the laboratory was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Eventually, funding disappeared. The Dolphin House was closed, and Margaret faced the part of the experiment she had probably dreaded most. Peter had to leave. She couldn't simply take him home. He was a dolphin. So Peter and the other dolphins were moved to another facility in Miami. But the new environment was nothing like the Dolphin House. The animals were kept in smaller tanks. There was little natural light, and Peter was separated from the environment and the person he had become accustomed to. Margaret never saw him again. Then came the phone call. Lilly told Margaret that Peter had died. According to Margaret's later recollection, Lilly used a disturbing word to describe what had happened. He said Peter had committed suicide. The idea became part of the mythology surrounding the experiment. The explanation was that dolphins consciously control their breathing. So, unlike humans, a dolphin could theoretically choose not to surface for another breath. And Peter had apparently stopped breathing. But there is an important problem. There is no scientific evidence that Peter consciously chose to die. We don't know what was happening inside his mind. We don't know exactly why he died. And calling his death suicide tells us more about how the humans interpreted the event than it tells us about what Peter actually experienced. What we do know is that he had been moved into a very different environment and died only weeks later. And that is where this story stops being a bizarre story about dolphins and becomes something much darker. Because the experiment began with an almost beautiful idea. Two intelligent species trying to understand each other. Humans trying to learn from another form of intelligence. A scientist looking at the stars and wondering whether dolphins could teach us how to speak with something alien. But somewhere along the way, the experiment lost its boundaries. A dolphin was isolated from its own species. A young woman spent months living in a flooded laboratory with him. LSD entered the research. Scientific ambition became mixed with personal obsession, and eventually, the project ended without achieving what it had promised. No alien language was discovered. No dolphin learned English. No bridge between humans and extraterrestrial intelligence was built. Only recordings remained, photographs, research notes, and one dolphin who died after being moved away from the world he had known. Perhaps the most disturbing part isn't that scientists once gave LSD to dolphins. It isn't even that a woman lived in a flooded house with one. The disturbing part is the question underneath the entire experiment. How far are we willing to go when we believe we're on the verge of discovering something extraordinary? Lilly believed dolphins could teach us something about intelligence. And maybe he was right about one thing. Dolphins really are extraordinarily intelligent animals. Modern research continues to investigate dolphin communication and cognition. But intelligence isn't the same thing as human language. And curiosity isn't the same thing as understanding. The dolphin house was supposed to create communication between species. Instead, it exposed just how difficult communication really is. Because the humans could speak, the dolphins could make sounds, they could interact, they could form relationships, but neither species could truly explain what was happening inside the other's mind. And perhaps that is why this story still feels so unsettling. For a brief moment in the 1960s, a scientist looked toward the stars and thought he might find the key to extraterrestrial communication in the mind of a dolphin. He built a house around that idea. He flooded it with water. He filled it with experiments. He filled it with hope. And eventually, the water was drained. The dolphins were taken away. The research ended, and the dream of talking to another intelligent species remained unanswered, because the first alien language humanity tried to understand wasn't spoken from another planet. It was already here, under the surface of the water, and we still don't know what it was trying to say.